If the sides of the pool are 5 feet, then it doesn't need an additional fence. If it's only 4 feet, it's supposed to either have a 5-foot fence or be extended to have a 5-foot rail above it.
I'll walk around the table.
Yeah. Yeah, we
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'd like to call this meeting to order. First order of business is to adopt the agenda for tonight's meeting. May I have a motion?
So moved.
May I have a second?
Second.
Any further discussion?
No.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay. Hearing none, motion carries. Thank you. Next order of business is to approve the Planning Commission meeting minutes of July 21st, 2020 as submitted. May I have a motion?
Motion that we approve the minutes as submitted.
May I have a second?
Second that motion.
Any further discussion? No? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay. Hearing none. Motion carries. Thank you. Tonight we have 2 discussion items. Discussion item 1, Shoreland Management Ordinance discussion. Discussion item 2 will be Downtown Parking Ordinance discussion. Marty, I'm guessing you're going to lead us through both of those?
I am going to.
All right, let's get started.
All right, thank you, Chair, Commissioners. Marty Dahl, Community and Economic Development Director for the city. We are nearing the home stretch in our long Shoreland Ordinance update discussion, so we are well-deserved applause. We are hoping to get our red line version cleaned up. You'll notice in your packet this time that we've got a much cleaner version of that red line with just a few things outstanding that we'll be discussing again this evening, and hoping we can get to a point to have something to bring before the council by the end of August. So my intention tonight is to talk through a few of those things again that are still hanging out there on the list for discussion. So just a quick overview of the items we'll be looking at tonight. We've got a few definitions: building height, clear cutting, impervious surface, patios, permeable patio and walkway, as well as steep slope. And then we've got a couple of other areas we'll be touching on, including nonconformities, lot area and width standards, controlled access lots, placement, height and design, water-oriented accessory structures, vegetation management, PUDs, and then we will also be reviewing some of the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District feedback that was provided to us since our last meeting. And in fact, I'm going to start with some of that Minnehaha Creek Watershed District feedback. Some of the feedback will be incorporated into the specific areas that we'll be talking, that will be highlighted. but wanted to give just a brief overview of the sections and the areas that the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District has asked for some additions to the red line ordinance. You likely read through the letter that was included in your packet and then saw that we've already included many of these into the red line. Many of them are administrative, more so incorporating the Watershed District and their rules and permitting by reference. As well as some of the collaboration items when things that the city and the Watershed District are doing in practice and just codifying those within the ordinance. So I do not have any of them pulled out or additional slides. I was going to just walk through what those changes or additions were, and if there's anything that you'd like to talk about further, we can stop and do so. But the permeable patio and walkway definition, you'll see when we get to that, they asked for a reference to the Minnesota Stormwater Manual standards when looking at what is considered permeable or pervious for those items. Section 22.3 talks about the restoration of wetlands, and they asked for an addition to have that be in coordination with the Watershed District. Section 22.3L asks for early coordination of any subdivision projects, variance requests, CUPs, those sorts of things that they would potentially have some jurisdiction or some governance in. And again, this is something that we typically try to do in practice. So this essentially just puts that in ordinance that they're notified at the time of application when those types of things come in. There are a couple of tributary clarification, or one tributary clarification and an additional tributary that they indicated should be added. You saw those in your red line ordinance. We'll be getting DNR confirmation on those, but I imagine that is likely correct and should be amended as requested. Section 22.6B and 22.7C asked for a reference to the Watershed District's floodplain rules as further governing setbacks. I think this hits some of the Lakes and Water Quality Committee feedback that we've had about trying to have at least some incorporation by reference to the floodplain when we're talking about setbacks and where structures can be. So I think this ties in nicely with that feedback, and it gives us that reference in the ordinance. 22.8C would be a reference to the Watershed District grading, filling, excavation, and riprap permit requirements. Section 22.8D asks that stormwater management facilities be consistent with Watershed District rules. And Section 22.10F asks for erosion control plans and again, stormwater management facilities, that those submittals and approvals be consistent with Watershed District rules. Any questions on any of that stuff?
No?
All right. So moving on, some of these I think we'll be able to breeze through. There will be other items that will probably require some additional discussion. So the first item on our list is under definitions, building height. As you'll recall, we had our definition of building height flagged by the DNR as not necessarily being able to measure that, how they would like to see it measured from the shore into onto the land. So we actually have just reincorporated the DNR definition of building height. We had, as I mentioned earlier, for as much as we possibly could, tried to incorporate any of our general definitions into the Shoreland ordinance definitions to not have conflicting definitions, but there's just some things that are really different, measured differently, defined differently when you're in a Shoreland district. So we've got a couple of those, and we've clarified that for purposes within the Shoreland district. This is what building height means, and it allows us then to use that figure that has been created by the DNR to determine the building height. Any comments or questions? Sound okay to everybody?
Yep.
Seeing head
Sounds
nods?
good.
All right.
Sounds good.
Clear cutting, so this was one of the items that was brought up during our public hearing by one of the speakers in the public hearing, that the word complete had been removed from that definition. I seem to get an indication from the Planning Commission during that public hearing that we thought the word complete should be added back in. So we did add that back in the red line, and this is just confirmation that the commission is okay with that adjustment to the definition, that clear cutting is the complete removal of trees or shrubs in a contiguous patch, strip, roll,
Looks good.
block.
Good, thank you.
All right. Moving on to impervious surface. So as you'll recall, the question that we had gotten from the DNR related to impervious surface was, what is the rationale of allowing a swimming pool as a pervious surface? So just for reference, I did include the definition that we have currently in the red line ordinance, where you see lot coverage, i.e. impervious surface, shall not include projections for bay windows, permeable walkways, swimming pools, fences, walls, open pattern decks, permeable patios, stairways, etc. So staff did a little bit of research into this and the use of swimming pools as a pervious surface. Victoria is not unique to using pools as pervious. Again, it has been just something that's been in practice long before my time here. Some points for consideration, if the commission believes we should leave that as impervious, is that the impervious surface definition in the DNR model ordinance is not in by rule. That's not a required definition to even have within our ordinance. So by having a definition at all, we are exceeding what the DNR minimum is for impervious surface. And on a more technical side of things, well, it can be looked at in a couple of different ways. Swimming pools can always accept rainfall and they don't overflow, so they're not contributing to the stormwater runoff, which is a rationale for why you would consider a swimming pool as a pervious surface and not counted against lot coverage.
If you have one of those covers, does that change it?
It would. I mean, in theory, you're now creating runoff. So if you've got your pool covered, you are creating runoff. So this, again, I think is one for the commission to determine whether or not we wish to continue to count swimming pools as pervious. And then, like I said, I think we've got some rationale that there is obviously some counter argument to that rationale, but providing some information back to the DNR as to why we think this is that way. So thoughts?
I would like to suggest not including a definition. If we're exceeding the DNR, I don't know that it's necessary. And I do think that a good percentage of people put covers on their pools.
I will say from a staff perspective, if we do begin counting swimming pools as impervious, I always have to think about what I'm saying before I say impervious, swimming pools as impervious, we will have a lot of non-conforming lots, because we haven't counted them, and if they are now counted, they're now non-conforming, legal non-conforming, and it will prohibit likely a number of shoreland lots, especially in newer developments where you have smaller lots and larger homes. It will limit the ability for folks to be able to add a swimming pool if we determine that a swimming pool is an impervious surface. So something else for the commission to consider.
When you're considering the swimming pool, is that just the pool itself, not the deck?
Right, so we typically, at least from a plan review standpoint, we will count the pool and the 2-foot apron around the pool that we will disregard from the impervious calculation. Any additional patio or concrete that folks want to build leading up to their pool, or where they want to be able to put their deck chairs, any of that would be counted as impervious surface and would be accounted for in that calculation.
I would certainly be pleased, as Laura had stated also, with the DNR definition and not going beyond that.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. At least sending it up to the council that way and seeing what their opinion is.
Sure. So we're thinking, or I'm hearing a consensus that going forward, we would look at swimming pools as an impervious surface, so they'd be counted against that calculation, the maximum. This one's a tough one.
Yeah, it is. Second guessing myself when you say it out loud.
Well, some of the pools, I mean, pools in general, I mean, they do have an overflow into them. I mean, you can only fill them so full.
Yeah.
And they're gonna flow, I mean, they overflow out into the yard or drain system or whatever. So, I mean, to say, and then of course if they have a cover on it, that makes it, which most pools are, have the covers on them, again, you're into the impervious surface because the water's not running in, it's running off the deck and into the yards or into the storm system.
Right.
And some of these newer developments with smaller lots really probably weren't meant to support a pool, were they? Yeah, and proximity to their neighbors and all that kind of stuff too, but.
Yeah.
Right, and you get into some of these newer neighborhoods, they're putting a community pool in instead of a lot,
And in that, the research that I did with our last ordinance for the pool, the fence, I think covers are, I mean, they've gained so much popularity. I mean, there's so many advantages to having a cover just from heating the pool, and keeping things
Keeping it
out of the
clean.
pool, keeping it clean, that we're probably going to see more. So I can see that rationale for keeping it
Yep.
pervious. So are we leaning that way? Is that where we're shaking our, is that
Pool-
the,
think
pool
so.
that the head nod?
impervious, right?
Okay.
So pool counts towards impervious surface maximum. That's what I'm hearing? Yes?
Yes.
That's nods? All right.
Are you seeing other cities reviewing this?
I haven't dug that deep to see who has changed things recently. I did just in my surface level kind of look through things. It's a mix across the board. Some people count them as impervious, some don't. But I couldn't say for certain if anyone's changed it recently or looked at changing how they're doing things. As I mentioned, we will end up with that change. We'll have some non-conforming lots that will non-conform because of the impervious. And I think another thing that we would probably do from a staff perspective, especially in those new developments, is make sure that's noted somewhere within the covenant documents as we're working with developers on those HOA covenant documents, just to make sure folks are aware when they're buying those lots. If we think, if that lot's already at 24% impervious surface, it's gonna be tough to add a pool to and not max out on the impervious surface of the lot.
I know you can't answer for the DNR, but you go back and forth with them. Do you have any idea why? I mean, with they're so comprehensive, why it's not in the rule? It's optional. You're gonna just a
Yeah.
feeling for that, or
Yeah, so the rule on Shoreland was adopted by the legislature, and then the DNR has taken what is in rule and created this model ordinance. So that's how that model ordinance has come into play, is they've taken the information that by the state legislature has passed and made into rule. I couldn't tell you why impervious surface wasn't part of that adopted rule. I don't know the answer to that.
fair enough.
Okay, we will adjust that from the definition. Next definition is patio. So we talked about this a little bit in a little more detail at our last meeting. So as you'll recall, the Victoria's definition of deck specifically says a deck is attached to a house. So trying to determine how do you govern those detached decks or the pervious or not impervious patios. So we have chosen to create a definition for those. This definition is slightly revised just based on some additional conversations and additional research as to how this was worded. So we are proposing defining a patio as a roofless outdoor space constructed from pavement, pavers, stone, decking, or other comparable materials that is separate from and does not project from the wall of a building. A patio is considered a structure, and for purposes within a shoreline district, a patio that is constructed to extend more than 3 feet in height above the ground is subject to the setbacks of either the principal structure, accessory structure, or water-oriented accessory structure, depending on placement and use. And this was in response to the DNR's question about how we would govern detached decks that are higher than 3 feet above the ground, because in rule, any deck that is detached above 3 feet needs to meet setback requirements of these three things depending on their placement. So this was our attempt to try to say how we would govern that. If it's above 3 feet, it's gonna have to meet either the water-oriented accessory structure, which you can have one, so you could have a detached deck, but then you wouldn't be able to have a shed. A regular accessory structure, which if you are out of the shore impact zone, could be put in place farther away from the water, or if it's closer to the house, of the principal structure, so. Sound good to everybody?
That sounds good.
So then piggybacking off the definition of patio, we also have added a definition for a permeable patio and walkway. This updated definition also includes some additional feedback as well as Minnehaha Creek Watershed District feedback, and has been refined just a little bit from the last time we talked about this. So we've defined this as any patio or walkway designed to facilitate the infiltration of water into the soil. A permeable patio or walkway must be constructed in a way that allows water to channel or absorb in the underlying soil or into a special storage layer and not create runoff. Permeable patios and walkways should be consistent with standards found in the Minnesota Stormwater Manual, which was a request by the Watershed District, and meet the following conditions: that all materials shall be installed per industry standard and conform to the specifications outlined in the Minnesota Pollution Control Stormwater Manual, shall be constructed of a grid of pavers or stone with void spaces, and include effective sublayers, have appropriate soils and site conditions existing to be able to function properly. And then the piece where we still do not have a good answer is the question from the DNR about how we plan to limit size. So one of the recommendations from the Lakes and Water Quality Committee was to reach out to the Watershed District, and the Watershed District that they said they didn't necessarily have a guidance on the size of these structures. There's some best practices in the Stormwater Manual, which is they asked us to incorporate by reference, but they said they don't really have a standard for what is too much to be considered actually permeable. So I don't have a good answer for that one right now. We can certainly go back and reach out to a few different groups, but I know there had been some discussion about whether or not that should be a set square footage, that we say this is the max and anything beyond that counts as impervious, whether that's a percentage of the lot based on the size of the lot. Size, I can tell you from a staff perspective, a square footage size is going to be easier to administer versus trying to calculate a percentage of how big those can be. So from an administrative size, if we were just to decide this is the size that we say is the biggest it can get, that would be the easiest to administer internally.
How much more difficult would it be to? I mean, it seems to just have, to me, having a cookie cutter. Okay, can't be any larger than this. Seems kind of cookie cutter, but.
We would request, if we decided to go by a percentage, we would request the applicant calculate that percentage.
Okay.
So we'd ask them to do a survey. So then it would just be a matter of confirming those calculations that based on and then again, trusting the survey, which for the most part, if you've got a registered survey, it's going to be valid. So not a ton more. You have to do a little bit more calculation and confirming things versus looking and saying, okay, that's the square foot and it meets it, but it wouldn't be.
If it's permeable, why does it become non-permeable as it gets bigger?
Because a pervious patio or walkway is not going to be 100% pervious. So if we were to determine that up to a certain size, we're going to count it as 100% pervious, but if it starts getting bigger, now we need to count some of that towards your impervious
You almost
maximum.
have to do it as a percentage of the lot size or something, because you could have a big home.
Right.
The square footage may not apply.
Right.
If it's a big home or a small home.
Unless, go ahead.
So if it doesn't, the larger the impervious area becomes, it becomes more permeable. What percentage would that be less permeable?
Well, so regardless of the size, even if you were to install a 5 foot by 5 foot pervious paver patio, that entire area of that size is not going to be 100% pervious, because you're going to have impervious surface on there. You're going to have some runoff that's going to create. So it's not necessarily the size that that dictates when you create the runoff, because you're gonna create some runoff. I think what we're trying to accomplish is that up to a certain size, we know this is gonna create some runoff, but it's gonna create so little runoff or not enough runoff that we'll count it as the whole thing as pervious. But if you all of a sudden say you wanna do your whole backyard as a pervious patio, you're creating runoff, so there's gotta be some cutoff where we start saying, okay, we have to start counting some of
At
this
least you won't
as
be throwing
impervious.
fertilizer on it.
Well,
Right.
I would say that based on what you just said, I think that's why you should use the percentages.
You're right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be the formula, is that it's relative to the size of the lot.
Yeah.
And, you know, exactly what that percentage would be or exactly what that formula would be. But, yeah, I think that would be certainly a relative calculation.
You know, when I think about this, I think about commercial lots, commercial properties, and how they address some of this, because sometimes in Chaska, for example, there's a development that the whole entire parking lot is permeable. And there just wasn't enough green space. They had to design it that way. Very expensive. The developer hated it, but it needs to be an option. Does our code allow for something like that?
Our code would allow for that in commercial district, I believe, but as you'll recall, in our only commercial district, our downtown area, we allow up to 80% impervious surface. So it's typically, it hasn't been an issue, but I think we would certainly account for some of that in our commercial areas. So I think what I'm hearing is we want to go percentage of lot. Staff can go and try to determine we'll work with some of our watershed partners and some other
Yeah.
folks and see if we can determine what seems to be appropriate, what size, what percentage we need to start calculating or counting against if that pleases the commission.
I think it can be a conservative number, considering that, you know, we're in the shoreland area. But I think of like a PUD and those tiers, and you think about the first tier and then the second tier. I mean, it makes sense to me that you might have a little more space, square footage in a first tier, larger lots, getting up in those smaller ones a little bit smaller. So I understand it might, you know, it probably is more work, but I think it might be the fairest, and it might be actually more conservative if the number gets dialed in right.
Right.
And again, I think we talked last time, this excludes driveways, right? It only pertains to the patio and walk.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Okay, now the fun one, steep slopes. So,
Better than slippery slope.
it's a slippery slope talking about steep slopes.
Seems to keep coming back.
So I had the opportunity to go back after our discussion and get a little bit more history on the steep slope and the change to the steep slope definition in the ordinance. So I'll go over that as we kind of walk through this, and then I think we've got some decisions to make at the end. But for everybody's reference and a reminder that the definition for steep slopes was updated in 2019. It was changed to slopes 18% or steeper, and then it provided the way that you calculate those slope sizes. That's the 1 and 2 below. Essentially tells you how you make that calculation. The reason this definition was changed is because there was a change or an addition to section 33-10 in our natural resources section of the city code that said that any significant slopes, trees, were to be preserved in their natural state. I believe this was in looking at some of the minutes and the conversation that took place. This was a response to some of the clear cutting of slopes and areas for new development and looking at a way to try to better govern and prohibit some of that clear cutting on those steep slopes. So The steep slope definition had been, and you'll see in the next slide, similar to what the DNR definition is a 12% slope. So it was changed to a steeper slope, and then essentially any tree clearing was prohibited within shoreland or outside of a shoreland. So some of you who were involved in the planning commission probably remember those discussions, and some of the public comment from landowners in those areas, because there was a map created that showed how many of these slopes existed in the growth area and within Victoria. So it was changed to be a steeper slope to have the cutoff, but then it was saying that those needed to be preserved and could not be clear cut. So when that ordinance was adopted, and it appears that it went back and forth to the council and the planning commission a few times, different iterations, there was some discussion and reservations about approving that ordinance when the tree preservation ordinance and the shoreline ordinance seemed to address similar concerns when it came to clear cutting. Comments about needing to allow flexibility for negotiating those preservation when there's preservation of tree stands when development is coming in. That the intent of the ordinance should not be to create a moratorium. That was something that was noted. And it was also noted in the city council minutes that the intent that this change in the ordinance was to be temporary until a more holistic view be taken to address all concerns. So that's I think that provides an opening for us if we are looking to do some tweaking to this, because the city council had been in favor. Not to say that we're going to take a holistic view of this evening, but I think it does provide us some flexibility as we look at this. So just to compare before we kind of jump into some of the options that I think are before us, the steep slope definition from the DNR is slopes that are at 12%, and it tells you how those are measured. So and I believe that our previous steep slope definition was nearly identical to what this is showing, that 12% slope. So as we're thinking about steep slopes as they pertain to the shoreland ordinance, there are a few different options, and the commission may have some other ideas or thoughts of ways we could address this. We could leave the current definition as is in the shoreland ordinance and not adjust it in our general definitions. We would then likely need to find a different way to address the DNR's concerns for those less steep slopes. The DNR considers 18% a bluff, and steep slopes, 18% is a bluff, 12% is a steep slope. So with our definition of 18%, we're essentially governing bluffs, but we're not governing what the DNR would consider a steep slope, because we're only governing those steeper areas. So that's an option, is to leave it and try to address those less steep slopes and the preservation of natural resources with additional language. We could, like some of the other definitions, amend the steep slope definition just for the shoreland ordinance. So we could say, for the purposes of shoreland, a steep slope is a 12% slope versus an 18% slope. We could also look at amending the steep slope definition for the general zoning code. If we were to do that, we wouldn't want to just change the definition, because we still have that prohibition. So now, instead of saying 18% slopes you can't cut, you now can't cut 12% slopes, which even increases that coverage on the map. So if we were to consider doing that, we'd also need to look at amending that 33-10 preservation of natural resources section, so that shoreland and non-shoreland were governed similarly. So for example, if we were to adopt the shoreland definition of clear cutting, which we mentioned before, talks about the complete cutting of those areas, and prohibit that on steep slopes, is another potential option. And as I said, this is a fun one, so I will turn it over to the commission to talk through.
Well, I always think about, whenever we're reviewing updates on ordinances, I always think about the application. So I'm assuming this applies to like new developments, like for example, the project that's on Pioneer and Victoria Drive that we were kind of having a hard time at figuring out what we were going to do in terms of the setbacks and the berm. right? So, the steep slope in there, would that, if this was in place with that steep slope, how would this impact this? This development.
It wouldn't necessarily be apples to apples because that berm is being created and it's not an already wooded steep slope. This is essentially governing those existing natural slopes that are wooded and trying to protect or preserve the trees in those areas. Now, there's going to be some landscape on those berms, and maybe in 30 years, that has now become an established wooded steep slope, and if nobody changes the definition of this ordinance in the next 30 years, now it potentially becomes a established wooded steep slope and would fall underneath that definition. But from the development side, because it's being created and planted, it wouldn't necessarily be a apples to apples connection with this.
Yeah, I think of this more for, potential land that could come into Victoria and those areas, when you look at, like you say, when you look at a map of that and you take that 18%, it washes out, takes out a lot of times a tremendous amount of land.
Right.
And I think, my personal feeling is that since we've done this in the last few years, I think we've caused some hardship to a couple landowners, and I'm not sure what the solution is, but I know that when we went to that 18%, that's what sort of triggered that. And so I'm not sure what the best solution is, but I know personally I'd like to see that backed out so that we give them a little more flexibility. I mean, there's still PUDs that are going to be coming before us. To me, it almost kind of goes back to that cookie cutter again. And I understand that some people aren't always in favor of PUDs, but I say give us some credit. I think we can hold people a lot of times to higher standards with that flexibility. But I'm not sure what the best route to do that of your options is.
Yeah, and again, I may be speculating here, but I think because there was some concern originally about that change in definition, I think both on the Planning Commission side as well as on the City Council side, I think there would be some support to looking at maybe backing out of that 18% steep slope definition. We're still providing the protection of clear cutting, right? Instead of prohibiting all cutting and cutting any trees down, we're loosening that up a little bit. It also now comes into play on a little bit less steep slope, right? So if you've got it, instead of just an 18% slope of bluff, if it's a 12% slope, it gives another opportunity for these groups to review and look at what the plan is for cutting those, whereas when we're talking 18%, we don't have much say if it's less than that, outside of our tree preservation ordinance. It still prohibits the clear cutting, right? So you can't come in and you can't cut everything down. You can cut some down, but you can't cut, if you've got a patch or a row of trees, you can't cut the whole works down to move forward. So I think there's potentially some support to reverting a little bit back on that. It would then give us some consistency between the Shoreland ordinance and the rest. You kind of just govern everything the same. If you're talking about steep slopes, wooded steep slopes, there's not a lot of difference whether or not that's within a shoreline or not within a shoreline. It's the same natural resources you're trying to protect. So to have some consistency makes some sense. Again, I think we've talked about that the DNR has done a lot of looking at best practices and how things work. So DNR uses that 12% and tries to protect those areas. So I think option 3 might be something to consider. Is that non-committal enough for you?
Well, what are the rest of any other thoughts?
I think it'd be good to adopt the 12% for both.
I know I was scratching my head on this before, and I never really understood why we wanted to change the language. But I'm still in a place where I'm like, why do we have to govern this at all? I mean, I wish the PUD process could vet it out at that time. Yeah. That's my personal opinion. It's not what you want, though.
Well,
Everything's
no,
not
it is.
PUD, right?
Yeah, that's true. Everything's not.
And I think there is some importance to trying to protect some of those natural resources, especially on those wooded steep slope areas. It's a lot of the character of Victoria with the rolling hills and the wooded hill areas. So you don't necessarily want to lose that all just to be cleared out all by development, but I think there's probably a middle ground where you can still protect that character, while allowing some flexibility for development.
Yeah, I hope that's not how I come off, sounding like we're going to go chop everything down, because that is absolutely the last thing I want. But I agree, there has to be some middle ground, because I'm concerned for these landowners that, this, a lot of times it's their nest egg. This is what they're sitting on, and we take a lot of it away. When I think we could still do a really good job with it. Or they can, together, working together, we can figure it out.
And I agree that we want to preserve the culture of the land and like the pretty rolling hills. I mean, that's fantastic, and I'd hate to see that changed. So I would support number 3.
Head nodding? Maybe?
I could go either way.
Well, either way, we consider that a nod. Are we sort of leaning towards, okay. I think we're probably leaning towards 3.
Okay, so what we will likely do is look at what that would mean code wide, right? Because that change would impact a few different sections. So we could look at providing some language that we'll bring back to review in this group before we move forward with anything on the steep slopes. We'll have another opportunity to look at it, but we'll move in that direction.
Good.
But to get into landscaping requirements would just kind of open up a whole nother can of worms, so to speak, to be able to maintain the land as it is and to prevent runoff and whatnot. So, yeah, I think number 3 is our best route.
And I'm going to ask you to do, John, one favor. Will you pull that microphone closer to your face? Thank you.
There you go.
Thanks.
All right. So I think that gets us through definitions. In the commission's review of the packet, any other definitions that stood out or things you wanted to talk about?
Oh, I did. We jumped over quick. Can we go back a slide? When we were talking about the, one more. Okay, even before it was okay. Perfect. We have the bullet points. All materials shall be installed per industry standards and conform to specifications outlined in Minnesota. Anything about, my concern is maintaining these permeable pavers. Does bullet point 1 address that, or do we need to address that further? It's almost like the pool deck. People have to keep those maintained. Permeable pavers, not all of them, but some do require maintenance. Otherwise, it'll pool on them.
I think the way it is written now, it does not speak to that, but I think we should include some sort of maintenance plan requirement as part of bullet point 1.
Yeah, I understand we're not going to go out there and examine them, but I think it's important to have a bullet point in there that they have to be maintained per manufacturer specifications, something along those lines.
That's a good call. And Marty, can you tell us once again on this one how you're suggesting this language to be changed?
For
The permeable patio and walkway? No, sorry, this is the pool. I'm sorry, the pool. we decided that the,
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I understand the language of
Yeah,
how
so
you're going to
that would
propose
have
it.
been back on impervious, and what I think we are going to do is just pull out swimming pools as an example of where we say lot coverage shall not include. So if you'll see on the slide there, that second sentence, we say lot coverage shall not include projections for bay windows, permeable walkways. We will strike swimming pools from that exception list.
How much of an issue is this going to be with city staff?
It shouldn't be, it's just gonna be a change of practice as we review plans. So when we get a proposal for a swimming pool, instead of counting that pool, not counting that pool against impervious, we just have to make sure we count that into the
Can we
calculation.
grandfather someone if they've already began the process?
Yeah, anybody who would be in application at the time this would be, adopted, we would grandfather in. That's typically how we handle it. If they're, even if they don't have it in the ground yet, if they're in application,
Okay.
we would allow them to go forward.
Thank you.
So you better get yours in quick.
Okay, so jumping over to nonconformities, we've had some discussion on this, and we've actually redlined some additional language in based on the feedback from the DNR and the discussions that we've had. So as you'll recall, this is the additions or expansions to the outside dimensions of a non-conforming structure. One of the DNR recommendations was limiting the height in that area, and I think we had some consensus that made sense. So we've indicated that the height does not go beyond 25 feet or the existing building height, whichever is greater. And then we also added, from the DNR's feedback, that for the purposes of this section, a permeable pavement or paver driveway shall not be considered a pervious surface, so they can't use that as a way to try to increase the size and increase the impervious coverage with those additions or expansions. Look good to everybody?
Good.
Good.
The other thing that we talked about was, or that was recommended by the DNR, was to having some other additional protective standard, and there was a discussion by the Lakes and Water Quality Committee that they didn't want to limit that to just shoreland restoration. So this is some draft language that staff has proposed with those nonconformities, that prior to the approval of a building permit, property owner shall submit a plan indicating additional stormwater management initiatives that will be undertaken as part of the addition or expansion, and that plan must be approved, installed, and maintained, and it may include establishment or reestablishment of natural riparian vegetation and installation of a rain garden or catch basin or swale to reduce runoff, a significant reduction of impervious surface on the property, or other approved stormwater mitigation. So essentially, as part of allowing that expansion of a non-conforming lot, we'd want them to provide us some sort of plan of, hey, we're gonna do this to improve stormwater and runoff, because we're gonna be adding some additional impervious in those areas.
Just to follow up on what you mentioned earlier about some clarification on a couple of those creeks that connect the lakes after lake, would you consider putting in a, or creek, like 6 Mile Creek,
Right.
some of those, might want to add that in there.
Yep, good point. Look good to everybody?
Does.
All right. And then you'll recall the other nonconformity flexibility request was related to those tear down rebuild properties. So we've added some additional language speaking to protective standards with those. One of them being that the setbacks of adjacent properties be considered to determine if allowing or not allowing that nonconformity will alter the essential character. So if you've got a lot, and again, if you'll recall, this one's a variance, so this would be something that would have to come before this body, but then it should be considered if you've got your neighbors on either side meet the setback, you've got a non-conforming lot that doesn't meet the setback, you've got the space to meet the setback, that should be part of the consideration of that variance. And then also that the maximum building height of that rebuild should not exceed 25 feet.
Like it.
Yep.
Looks good.
All right. So lot area, width, and setback standards. So I don't have anything new from what we've talked about, but I just want to make sure that we are all comfortable with those numbers that we have in place right now. We will be, I've asked our city manager to have some discussion with our city council in her one-on-one meetings to talk about the potential of having the two different standards, because that seems to be the preferred way, both by the Planning Commission and the Lakes and Water Quality Committee, if the city council is will consider that. So trying to get a little bit of additional feedback prior to bringing an ordinance forward about having those two separate standards. So hopefully by our next meeting, I'll be able to report back whether or not that's going to be a hard no or not, if we want to continue this path. But assuming that we do, just wanted to make sure that we are all comfortable with the standards, with the current city limit standards being the current standards, and then the growth area being the DNR standards, with the exception of the non-riparian natural environment lake lots, which we were asking for some flexibility down with increased standards on the riparian side for those lakes.
Looks good.
Looks good.
All right, I will take that as a yes. So moving on, controlled access lots. So I think during our last meeting, we discussed wanting to maintain the DNR language. Staff did propose a potential, some potential additional language that might help determining those variances. So if you were to allow more than 6 watercraft, the proposed language that we've added is a variance may be granted to allow the docking, mooring, or overwater storage of more than 1 watercraft. Lake size, typical boat traffic, resident feedback, and other considerations will be taken into account when considering whether to grant a variance. Because technically in our waterways ordinance, we only allow 1 dock, 1 mooring spot per property, so it would have to be a variance to allow more. So this gives us some baseline of what will be considered, whether or not to grant that variance. And then using the DNR language that if you're gonna grant a variance for more than 6, that lot needs to be wider. And this is the table that from the DNR ordinance that talks about how much wider that needs to be increased if you are going over 6.
If we can go back to the previous slide, when a prospective homeowner or developer is looking at this, I would like it if there was a little bit more language on here that just says, mentions the reference to DNR's language below. If you could say, see exhibit or see section, blah, blah, blah. Do you know what I mean? CDNR section, whatever section this is taken from their language.
I think the intention would be that the
together?
sentence above would be incorporated into that section of the DNR. So it would be the first paragraph, and then the rest of the DNR language would be directly below it.
Okay, good.
All right.
Yeah, I think that's good. That gives some flexibility. I like it.
Vegetation management, and this kind of is similar to some of the things we talked about with that impervious surface and wanting to add in some sort of requirement for maintaining those items. So this is related again to that clearing and trimming that is allowed on shore and bluff, steep slope and bluff impact zones. With our tree preservation ordinance, and then some of the conditions that are required when you are doing that clearing and cutting. So staff has proposed adding just an addition to number D that says perennial ground cover is retained and a maintenance monitoring plan is established. This is something that the Watershed District is familiar with and typically requires when they're looking at wetland related improvements and changes. So it seems appropriate to require something similar when you're doing that clearing and cutting on those bluff and steep slope areas. All right.
Agreed.
Looks good.
So then I think the last piece of our shoreland discussion is related to the residential planned unit development and discussing potential added flexibility to those PUD standards based on the comments from the public hearing. So as you'll recall, we had John Shardlow from Stantec, who is representing the Meat Cutters property, and I believe we've got, Charlie, yeah, who's here as well from Stantec, works with John to sit in on the meeting as well. But there was a request to consider some additional flexibility specifically as it relates to the ordinary high water line setback when you're dealing with unique properties, narrow properties such as the Meat Cutters that has some constraints. So you were provided some of the information that Mr. Shardlow had sent to the commission to take a look at what some other areas are doing. And it's been summarized in the slide in front of you is to potentially provide an opportunity for a variance to that setback with conditions. So with that, I think I'll turn it over back to the chair and commission to discuss thoughts on that and whether or not that's something you want to look into incorporating.
Any thoughts? I have thoughts, but I'll hold them. I always look that way first. I'm sorry. I
think flexibility would be good. I think we should enable flexibility and look at the overall quality of the PUD and what it brings to the city and the potential residents. It seems like we could have some flexibility.
It's not an enthusiastic nod.
No,
That's just
I
kinda-
think that's reasonable. That's reasonable. It's, yes.
Yeah, I think it is too. I got to go back. I said cookie cutter a couple times earlier, and I think that, I know that within the community we've had some PUDs, like I guess the name of it is escaping me right now on Schutz on the north side. That's kind of a goal or a ideal, but that doesn't mean it's perfect in the Meat Cutters property or someone else's property. And I think there's possibilities to even do better. But you have to have that flexibility and faith in this commission or the next commission or the next city council. It's going to, it changes, but you have to have a little bit of faith that the folks up here are trying to do the right thing. So I think flexibility is.
Well, each shoreline is different.
Absolutely.
You have different situations
For sure.
for every lake that's out there. And whether the purpose of the lake or what it is, or the design of it. So you have to be able to be flexible and allow for variances according to what the developer and the landowner wants to propose.
Right. I think it's in the best interest of the city, developer, landowner, to incorporate some of these, flexibility, and I'd definitely be in favor.
We just can't state what the flexibility is because we don't know what the situation is.
Right.
Meanwhile, we have enough framework throughout the code to guide us.
Right, I think, again, as you'll recall, part of this ordinance update process is that we're looking to get approval from the DNR. So likely if we're looking for some flexibility to have the opportunity to present a variance on high water line setback, we'll likely have to include some additional, more protective standards to offset that. So, for example, some of the ideas here, I think it was the Wayzata ordinance that was referenced that had some of these additional conditions. We'd likely be looking to incorporate some of those things, especially the shoreland impact plan. I think you're really looking at that management and maintenance plan where you're making some guarantees that it's going to be retained a certain way. They will probably also be looking to make sure that a variance won't be granted to allow them any closer than the shore impact zone. So that's something we'd be likely looking to incorporate as well. And then we'll have to see what the DNR says to that. But I think we've got a good starting point for that one.
I do also, I think the addressing them individually, while that certainly is a lot more work, that's what our work is, I believe. And I think, to provide that flexibility at the same time on the individual project. So I would concur.
All right, we will work at adding some additional language to bring back to our next meeting to
Good.
take a look at.
Great.
And that concludes all of the staff highlighted areas. But before we conclude, I just want to make sure that commission doesn't have any additional items as if you've done your review that you want to discuss or talk about.
Anything else?
That's
Any more discussion? We're good. Thank you.
Yeah, so just right before we wrap up, our tentative timeline, we may, just based on some of the conversation we had tonight and looking at some of this additional changes, we may end up looking at bumping that ordinance consideration to the first meeting in September for council, because we need to have our ordinance published 10 days in advance. We've got a few things we want to check with the DNR on. So I had a sense that might happen before our meeting tonight, but wanted to see how the conversation went and where we went with that. But I'm thinking we will likely be looking at amending this just slightly and bumping that consideration out 2 more weeks just to continue to work through. So we can make sure we've got everything wrapped up and are comfortable with it.
Reasonable. Good.
All right. Excellent.
Thank you. Okay, one more discussion item tonight. Downtown parking ordinance discussion.
Yes, sorry. So, Chair, Commissioners, I do not have a formal PowerPoint presentation for this item. This is really more of a reintroduction of the downtown parking ordinance discussion and kind of an update of what we're doing internally as staff and where we're looking at bringing this and the commission's involvement as we move forward. So just was going to provide a little bit of information, open it up to any high-level discussion or thoughts at this point in time, but know that this will be something that will be similar to the Shoreland ordinance process, although hopefully not 3+ years like the Shoreland ordinance process was, but similar process where we will have multiple ongoing meetings and discussion and looking at revisions. But just as a little bit of background, as many of you recall that in 2018, the city contracted with the HKGI to conduct a downtown Victoria parking study. That study was finalized and adopted in 2019, and it was really meant to provide a framework for implementing a district-wide parking approach for downtown. And its primary objectives of that study was to collect and assess a sample of the utilization counts for downtown Victoria. So the study actually includes some real-world counts. There were boots on the ground counting cars parked at different times of the day and different days of the year, to also then develop a parking tool to be able to assess redevelopment or changes in use and what their impacts are going to be on the parking downtown, and then establish strategies and recommendations that would support a district-wide parking approach. So that study, as you'll recall, and it was also included in your background packet, provided several recommendations that were kind of a menu of options for the city to consider to move forward with amending or updating its downtown parking. Some of those recommendations, such as some of the wayfinding signage and things, have been implemented. There were other recommendations that have been tried and were not necessarily successful, at least the first go-around, such as valet parking. I know there were a few businesses that tried doing that for a while. There were also some discussions with the downtown business after that study about a potential downtown district, taxing district that would be able to collect funds to build a parking structure that, at least at the time, didn't seem like there was a ton of interest in. So the city has gone through and either implemented or started or had some conversations on some of those recommendations. And one of those recommendations where we're looking to go right now is that ordinance update and looking to really try to create some sort of shared parking model ordinance. So just as some additional background, our current downtown parking requirements, and the link was included in your packet, talks about new developments and the parking counts that are associated with uses. So, depending on what the use of that building is gonna be, our ordinance says that you need X amount of parking spaces based on your, most of the time, square footage. And then downtown, you have the ability to reduce that by up to 50% to accommodate the lack of parking, wanting to maintain a walkable downtown and not have a sea of parking lots. So while the ordinance says that it can be reduced up to 50%, in practice, when we're seeing these things happen, it usually is starting at 50%. So it's coming in, doing that calculation, dividing it in half, and coming in with that 50% mark. And even with that 50% reduction, a lot of times it becomes a challenge for some of these uses to be able to accommodate the parking that would be required based on the ordinance. And then, as you'll recall in that study, which did those utilization counts, we are not necessarily at capacity. So the question and the recommendation of the study was that instead of building more parking, new parking, let's use a shared model throughout the district where we've got our total counts. We kind of know how they're being used during the day, who they're being used by, and we know what our excess capacity is. And that way, when a new use comes in or a redevelopment, we can say, we know we have X amount of capacity. We think your use is going to generate X amount of capacity, and we either can or can't accommodate that within that calculation. So that's kind of the gist of what we're going to be looking to do with this updated ordinance, or at least the potential updated ordinance.
So when you park like, noon and you're kind of across the street from the post office, say if spaces are reserved for the borough, well, the borough doesn't really do anything, at least not too much at that time of day. Who defines that those are reserved for them? Is that what
Right.
you're talking about? The fact that those could be open to everybody?
Right, and that would be part of the conversation, because the borough parking lot is a private parking lot. So the borough building owns their parking lot. It's utilized like a public parking lot in that folks are parking there if they're not necessarily going to the borough. But the borough, it is a private parking lot, so they have some signage is specifically for them. They have the ability to do that, being a private parking lot. I think the idea would be that in the shared model ordinance, you've got the borough as a willing partner to say, we want to incorporate our parking lot as part of this, so it can be counted as towards the total available parking. This is what that would look like. It would likely be some sort of agreement with the city to do that. But because they are a private parking lot, they would have, they do have the ability to do signage and reservation. This would be more so, we look at all of the parking spaces that are available, public parking spaces that are available. And we've just added some additional up by the new Public Works site. We've got the sites along Steiger that were not in place when the study took part. They were being constructed, but they weren't in place. And then based on our utilization counts from the study, during the day, you can say, I think we're at like 50% capacity of those available spaces. So if you've got a use that comes in that's a daytime use, there's a lot of capacity available. Nighttime, we get closer to being at capacity, although the study shows we weren't truly at capacity yet, but we're getting closer. That is then maybe when you say, well, we've got X amount of capacity, but we think you're going to generate more than that. So you also need to have some parking associated with your business as you redevelop or however that works. I think that's the, again, very 100,000 foot level idea of what we'd be trying to accomplish. So not necessarily saying new business, we run the calculation, you need to build 50 parking spaces to meet your use.
Is the 50% parking ratio part of the CBD zoning?
Yeah, that 50% reduction is part of the CBD. So that's only for parking within the CBD, is that you can reduce those calculations by 50%.
Can you make it less? Can you make it 40%? 45%?
Right, it can. I mean, I think I think everything is up for discussion. But I think when we're thinking about that, this is more of a shared parking model approach. There might not be a percentage, right? It might be you look at this is what in real life, this is how much parking we think you're gonna generate at a given time. And then that is compared to what is the real world parking available, at least based on the assessments that have been done. Part of phase 2 was also to do an updated parking count. Right now is not really the best time to do updated parking counts, just because of the lack of folks going out and doing things. That would certainly be something that, assuming we ever do get back to some sense of normalcy, that would be part of the shared parking model, is that periodically those parking real world utilization counts are redone, whether that's every 2 years or what that, or after a use that comes in that we know is gonna have a huge parking impact, you go out and do some counts, so that you can always have the most up-to-date numbers to be able to use in that tool, whatever that tool ends up being. But we are not going to do an updated parking count as part of the work we're looking to do with some consultants, just because we don't think it would do us any good at this point in time. It's just not gonna be, I shouldn't say that. Potentially it could be what it's gonna be for a long time, but we just, at this point in time, we don't think it will be. But we are looking, and we've asked, we're getting a few different proposals in from a couple of different consultants, HKGI being one of them who did the initial study, to provide a proposal to how do we go about determining what that next step is and looking at moving towards this shared parking model and whether or not that makes sense. So specifically, we'll be looking to work with someone to verify those study goals and objectives to just make sure that what was determined in 2018 is where we still want to be. Determine the number of parking spaces, public only, that are available for future development, so we can have a true count again with all of the additional parking that has been put into place, and use that as a baseline. Establish some updated parking requirements for land uses within downtown. And that's what we've talked about. What are those real world parking? What's the real world utilization and the real world impact of those? And then creating that tool that would help us when we get a new use or we get a redevelopment, to determine how does that impact relate to the parking available, and then developing recommendations for updated language for that parking ordinance for downtown.
Did we see a big demand from businesses for more pickup spaces to go? And obviously when summer's gonna depart and we may be back to, now you eat outside, people may be still hesitant to go inside, and that the to-go business still important to them. Did any of them ask for more spaces like that?
I anticipate that we are going to get more requests for specific in front of the building to go spaces. So as the commission will recall, when the COVID situation hit and bars and restaurants were looking to reopen, and the governor, encouraged flexibility on zoning ordinances to allow some expansion, we loosened up our downtown parking ordinances to allow folks to utilize those public spaces for their businesses. And we did have one business that said, we don't necessarily want to expand outside seating, but we would like to use some public spaces to sign specifically for pickup for a business. And we felt like that was a reasonable ask in this situation. I anticipate that the request is going to be even after COVID is over for those to remain. I think with more and more businesses doing more and more pickup, that's going to be something that's going to be requested by other businesses, other restaurants specifically, to look at having some front of building spaces that are specifically reserved for that. And that's something we've been talking with the consultants we're talking to about. This is going to be a little bit different new normal than had we done this process a year ago, right? And that's going to be a big piece of it, is there's going to be a demand, and I think there's going to be a benefit to having some of that, even if it's public parking in front of a building, allowing some of those restaurant businesses to be able to have a spot or two dedicated.
I have a few thoughts. Are you done?
Yeah, so we're, like I said, we're looking at getting some proposals and starting that process, and it will be before you several times going forward.
Oh, I'm sure.
So when you do your calculations for the parking counts based on usage, are you going to use the same ratio is for all businesses and future businesses, so it's across the board the same for all business types?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea would be that you've got some sort of generalized an impact, right? We'll call it a parking impact. So if you've got a new restaurant, you've got some sort of idea or baseline of what that parking impact is going to be. There may be some flexibility based on, again, I think size of the business or how the business is going to operate, whether or not, if they're going to want to focus on to go or not to go. But I think the idea would be that, yes, you'd have at least a generalized baseline for restaurants typically are going to take up this amount of parking during the day and this amount of parking during the night. An office location with 5 staff is, insurance office is going to typically use this amount of parking during the day and probably not any at night, right? So
Would
we'll
an
have some.
establishment with alcohol have more parking demands or less, or the same?
That I don't know, that from my knowledge of parking and parking engineering, I don't know what is the higher impact use, but that would be something that, as
Just
we're working
curious.
with our
It seems like it
consultants.
would, but I'm
Seemed like, like when we went through this in 2018, that was always kind of inferred. I mean, because I remember that was one of the recommendations is maybe holding off liquor licenses
Yes.
to keep
Yep.
traffic
Yes. Right.
down.
right.
Because people might stay longer. Their duration of their visit
Correct.
could
Right.
be extended out.
That's right. I mean, if we implement this, we want our businesses here to be successful. I mean, that's the goal.
Yep,
You know,
absolutely.
so while I'm in favor of the shared parking plan, I have a concern about this row of parking that's been added down here. When it was installed, do you know, was there a survey with all the businesses? Did they say they wanted the parking way down there? Did they say that would help their businesses?
Which parking is that, sorry?
The row of parking.
Just
that's
Steiger Lane.
On
on
Steger?
Steger
Steger
down
Lane.
here, yeah.
And again, this was before my time here, so I don't know that necessarily the thought was that parking specifically in that location was going to be the benefit, but the idea was that any additional parking within walking distance was going to help.
Good for the farmer's market.
I mean, it is good for the farmer's market, but when you do your calculations, you're using those stalls.
Right, and that's part of this whole process,
part,
right?
yeah.
Is there's definitely a capacity count, and then there's a perception piece to it as well, because you may have 40 spaces a minute away, right? But if you drive around just the core of downtown and you can't find a parking spot because everything's full, the perception is that there's not enough parking. Whereas in reality, you've got some capacity, not that far away, right? Even our new public works site where we've got the gravel is now striped for additional parking. It's a 2-minute walk from there to the core of downtown, which when you say it out loud, 2-minute walk doesn't seem like it's that far, but when you're driving around looking for a parking spot and you're not conditioned, right, to have to walk a little bit of a distance.
Well, easier said than,
Matters.
You'd be in Chaska. You
Like,
might be in
let's
Chaska.
say I'm gonna go to Floyd's and I can't find parking over there.
Right.
And that's my only option, I'm not gonna go. You know, I'll bike, I'll go home and get my bike.
well, it's easier said than done, but you would hope that businesses would encourage their employees to take some of those spots so customers could get a little closer, but that's easier said than done.
That was easier said. I mean, I'm reliving, I'm sure you are reliving all these conversations, and the perception just varies so much from person to person. I mean, not lately, but how many times do you go to Target and you park in the back and it's a 2-minute walk, but you can see it. You know, it's right there. It's a lot different than going around the corner. And I agree. I mean, I think that was I think it was a big point, having employees park down here. But
Safety, that was an issue,
safe, right? I was going to say safety comes up from the owners. I mean, that all of a sudden, if you're, you have a 16-year-old male or female, and you're sending them out to their car at 11 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock at night. But downtown, owners walk them. I mean, you have to. I mean, everybody has to sacrifice a little bit for that. And that's easier said than done too. But but I think the one thing is you're right. I think more than anything, I think things have changed somewhat since 2018. I was trying to remember, Winchester and Rye, I think at that point was just coming in, and we were afraid of it, but we didn't know the impact
Right.
yet. So now we've sort of seen that. So that's changed. And then we like you said, there are some more spots. So it almost seems like at a base level, for sure, we need kind of a new, okay, what's the current situation?
And what's the word on the street? Like, what are the restaurants saying before pre-COVID? Let's say, call it January, February. I mean, was there, what would they say? I'm just curious.
My experience may not be indicative of what's really being out there, but I can tell you that since I've been here since January 21st, which was only 2 months, month and a half before the COVID thing, I haven't gotten any parking complaints. Now, whether or not that's just because they didn't want to hammer on the new guy, I don't know. But
Well, I think people, we are what we are right now. It's just that was the hard part too. I remember being in the room here with all the business owners and everybody wants parking in front of their place. But it's not there. I don't know. It's a hard solution.
And part of it is too, like I said, it's a conditioning and a mentality because with Victoria being a growing community and growing so fast, and our downtown kind of being established, redeveloped here, and we're trying to create a more urban type feel, walkability, but in a community with 9,000, 10,000 people, you're used to being able to park right in front of the business you want to go to and get in. Whereas, obviously not comparing downtown Victoria to downtown Minneapolis because it's two completely different beasts, but similar concepts, right? Walkable downtowns. You wouldn't think twice about walking a couple minutes from a parking garage to a restaurant or a business in a downtown area. So I think there's a middle ground there, right? You don't want downtown Victoria to be downtown Minneapolis, but there are some of those walkability and urban downtown concepts that I think as the community continues to grow and as the downtown continues to develop, that there may be a little less angst of having to walk a minute and a half to get places, but you certainly want to be as accommodating as you can while also not creating, using prime downtown real estate as parking. So it's a balance.
I do think the parking signs helped. I know just myself personally, I had no idea that I could park across the street in that lot. And even in our lot, you just don't think of parking there. And I think that's helped.
Definitely.
So this was approximately 6 years ago, and it was a city council organized group that was put together to study parking in downtown Victoria, roughly 6 years ago. And one of the, and there was some incredible ideas, quite frankly. And one of them that I brought up was parking meters for the purpose of revenue. And that obviously didn't go anywhere.
That wasn't one of those great, phenomenal ideas then, is what you're saying, right?
Well, maybe it is today. But as a point of reference, we were in, Friday noon, we were in Duluth by Fitkers. And that's a very, very busy area with the Fitkers complex and then all of the other restaurants that are associated. Meters every place. And 2 hours maximum. And there were people that were driving until there was, a meter or a slot that was open. And my wife and I were talking about it, and she said, you look at downtown Minneapolis. I haven't been there for a long time, but in Europe, in all of the major cities in Europe, everything is parking meters for as far as you can see until you kind of get out of the city. Now, I don't know what the economics of parking meters is. I don't know what the control, in terms of traffic flow control is with meters. But again, all of the major cities in Europe, you go anywhere and there's meters all over. And then hadn't been in Duluth for some time, and here was meters as far as you could see around Fitkers, and very, very, very busy area. So, Yeah, it would be interesting for me, and I think for us, to know what the economics of that really is. You know, I would think
I think that was kind of
the
the
original
plan.
investment would be
Yeah.
huge.
I think I know we talked about it. I think that was kind of that's kind of the next level is looking at some of those other options because there's some there's some pretty amazing parking meters these days too, not just
It's no longer coins.
no longer really any
Credit
parking
card.
meters, right?
It's your
But
credit card, tell me what spot you're in, but who's policing
Right.
when my time's expired? Who's gonna give me a ticket? Otherwise, it's a joke. I just won't.
well, we have 2-hour time limits right now, I think, in a lot of Victoria, but nobody's.
Is it, so, let's say, I don't know, $30,000 is raised by meters a year.
What's
Is
that?
that money, what do you do with that money? Where does it go? Does it go in a fund towards a parking garage, or where does it go? Does it just go towards improving roads? I mean, I guess we need to know why we need the meters. Are we just trying to reduce parking, or?
Yeah, I think it's, I would view it, and I certainly don't know because I've never studied it in depth, but I would view it as a control mechanism, quite frankly, at the same time, and a source of revenue. At the same time, it would go into whatever the city council determines, but, you know, I wouldn't think it would go into a general fund. I would think it would go into, you know, something specific. But you know, it wasn't a viable option 6 years ago, apparently. But I don't know if it is, but it's, you know, now that we're looking, you know.
Well, I'm sure they'll look at it.
And again, you know, all over Europe, one could imagine that it would work if it's that widespread.
I'd love to see case studies on this. That would be helpful for me to understand, you know, why a city chose to add any or some meters, and then how they chose to spend that money. Because I think those are really important questions.
Yeah, I wouldn't think that anyone would want it to go into a general fund. I think you'd want it to go specifically to pay for what we're attempting to solve.
Also, were the businesses negatively impacted?
Yeah, well, I think too, I think around us, we've had some examples of this. I know Excelsior recently considered it, and I don't believe they went forward with any parking meters. I think Wayzata considered it. I mean, they built a couple small ramps kind of behind, but it's still a long walk to get to different places, but they.
Along the main strip, there's no parking meters, but if you go
along
by one of these parks or something, you gotta pay to park.
Where?
I think so.
There's like one of the water.
Oh, yeah, when you're down along the water, right. But
down
they
along
didn't
the
put it
water.
right in that downtown corridor along Water
They
Street,
probably
right.
thought you'd park there and be there for the day or something, but.
Yeah.
It's a tough sell.
Yeah, I know.
It's a
But
tough
not in
sell.
the.
That's why we hire consultants.
It's not, that's not necessarily to say that's not a good option. But
No.
It's a tough sell.
Well, I think it's good to pick it up again. Like I said before, I think things have changed, and knock on Formica. Hopefully, we get back to somewhat of a new normal, and I'm sure once people forget a little bit about COVID, they'll be worrying about parking again. I'm sure parking kind of moves to the back, all things considered,
That'll
right
be a
now.
good problem.
Right. Let's hope for parking problems.
I have nothing else on this item.
Okay. Thanks. Any other discussion or items, Brad? I think it's a good thing to look at it again, though. Good. Okay, that being the case, anything, move on to the miscellaneous section. Staff, anything?
Staff does have one item of miscellaneous. So on last Friday, we submitted an application for a livable communities development grant from the Met Council to provide some funding for the 13.5 acre development. So we're still working with our partner for potential phase 1 of that development for that 125 unit market rate apartment. Anyone who watched the city council meeting, not this week, but last week, Kimley Horn, who did our feasibility study on the area of how we would extend utilities, street alignments, potential layouts of the area, broke it into phases, costs associated with those phases, So that was presented at the council, so if you're interested in looking at that discussion presentation, please do so. But we are looking, again, we're seeking a grant from the Met Council for about just under $900,000 that would fund the central green of the 13.5 acre property, some stormwater facilities, as well as some of the grading on site as part of the phase 1 with the apartment complex. We've got no formal application in place yet. As soon as we do that, we'll obviously come before this body, but we are working from a staff level to try and get phase 1 of that development off the ground and seeking some grant funds to help us with that. So fingers crossed that we will be successful, but wanted to share that with the commission.
That's good news.
Can you share, is it the same partner as before?
Yes, yep.
Can you update us on anything new with the Southern Victoria?
10 and 11?
Yes.
Yeah, down on,
Yeah,
South
down
end?
The Geststock, Vogel,
Yes.
Welter area. So staff did actually meet with the Geststock, Vogel property folks. Again, they have another potential developer in that area, new from previous discussions that we've had. So there is at least interest, there's still interest in that area and trying to get something done. So that we actually met with them last week.
Oh, good.
So relatively recently.
And
what
then
about the far corner?
moving further south?
As you go all the way down, yeah.
We believe that the Welter property is still the same group that was working with the Welter property previously is still working with them. They were waiting for the outcome of the Chask Creek study as well as the 10 and 11 study roadway to look at access spacing. We haven't, it's probably been since March since we spoke to them, but as of March, they were still interested in moving forward with an updated sketch as soon as they had information. So I think there's still interest in those two properties, and hopefully something will move forward.
Has access been finalized now?
Yeah, did you
It
hear
hasn't
back
been
from Carver?
finalized yet. There are proposed access in those areas
Yeah.
based on the study, but the study hasn't been finalized yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that has to get final before development.
For sure. 'Cause it was a right in, right out, if I remember right. Yeah. Good. We might be busy.
That's all from staff.
A busy fall.
Fine.
Commissioners, anything miscellaneous, anyone?
Nope.
Going once, going twice. In that case, do I have a motion to end tonight's meeting, close tonight's meeting?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? I don't think so. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Hearing none, this meeting is officially closed.